You've probably heard about Scottish Highland clearances, but what was it like? What happened? The Highland Clearances, known in Scottish Gaelic as Fuadaichean nan Gàidheal, the eviction of the Gaels, were a transformative and tragic period in Scottish history. Spanning from the mid-18th century to the late 19th century, this era of forced evictions and widespread migration fundamentally altered the social, economic, and cultural fabric of the Scottish Highlands. These events, steeped in both economic pressures and political change, are remembered as one of the most defining and heart-wrenching episodes in Scotland's past. To understand the Highland Clearances, one must first grasp the traditional clan system that dominated Highland life for centuries. Clans, often led by a single powerful family, were the bedrock of Highland society. Chiefs were both patriarchs and landlords, offering protection and a sense of belonging to their members, who in return paid rent or provided military service. Land was managed communally, with farming, grazing, and hunting rights shared among the people. However, by the 17th century, the cracks in this system began to show. James V of England and VI of Scotland sought to weaken the clans, viewing them as a source of rebellion. The Statutes of Iona, 1609, forced clan chiefs to send their heirs to lowland schools, diluting Gaelic culture and binding the Highlands more closely to central authority. The final blow to the clan system came after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. Following the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie at the Battle of Culloden, the British government implemented harsh measures to suppress Highland identity. Traditional dress was banned, bagpipes were outlawed, and clan chiefs lost much of their autonomy. What had once been a tightly knit martial society began to unravel. The first phase of the clearances: agricultural change and enclosure. By the mid-18th century, the Highland economy was still rooted in subsistence farming. The run-rig system of communal farming was inefficient and could not meet the demands of a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, lowland Scotland was modernizing, driven by the agricultural revolution. Highland landlords, many burdened with debt, saw an opportunity to emulate their southern counterparts by transforming their estates into profitable enterprises. The first wave of the Highland Clearances, beginning in the 1760s, was driven by the enclosure movement. Land that had previously been used collectively was divided into private plots, often fenced off to make way for large-scale sheep farming. Cheviot sheep, which yielded high-quality wool, were introduced to replace mixed farming and cattle grazing. Sheep farming was not only more lucrative but required far fewer workers, making many tenants redundant. Displaced families were often resettled in coastal areas on small crofts, plots of marginally arable land. These crofters were expected to supplement their meager farming with fishing or kelp harvesting. However, these industries were precarious and provided little stability. The early clearances met with sporadic resistance. One of the most notable uprisings occurred in 1792, known as the Year of the Sheep. In Strathrossdale, tenants organized to drive thousands of sheep off their lands in protest against enclosures. Although the rebellion was quickly suppressed, it signaled the growing discontent among Highlanders. The second phase of the Highland Clearances: population growth and economic collapse. The second phase of the Highland Clearances, spanning from approximately 1815 to the 1850s, was a period of profound and escalating disruption for the Highland communities. While the first phase had already begun the disintegration of the traditional clan-based society, this second wave brought even greater suffering due to a combination of population pressures, economic downturns, and natural calamities. These forces combined to create conditions that would culminate in the most aggressive and devastating clearances of the era. By the early 19th century, Highland communities were experiencing significant population growth. Unlike many other regions of Europe where industrialization began drawing people into cities, the Highlands saw its rural population expand due to natural demographic trends. Families and crofting communities grew larger, and land that had once been marginally sufficient for subsistence farming became increasingly inadequate. When tenants were evicted during the first phase of the clearances, many were relocated to small plots of land along the coasts known as crofts. These plots were too small to sustain families through farming alone, and were intended to be supplemented by activities like fishing or kelp harvesting. As the population increased, the available land on crofts was subdivided further among families, leaving each household with even less land to cultivate. This overcrowding led to widespread poverty and growing dependence on external factors, such as the availability of jobs or successful fishing seasons, which were anything but guaranteed. The rising population not only placed immense strain on the crofters, but also on landlords, who saw the overcrowded settlements as a burden. Crofting communities, already paying minimal rents, were often unable to meet their obligations due to failing harvests or the collapse of secondary industries. This financial burden made landlords increasingly eager to remove crofters altogether, leading to more forced evictions during this phase. The economic backbone of many Highland crofting communities relied not just on farming, but also on supplementary industries such as kelp production, cattle rearing, and wool production. The collapse of these industries during the early 19th century was catastrophic for the region. Kelp, a type of seaweed harvested along the coasts, was used to produce soda ash, an essential component for manufacturing glass and soap. By the late 18th century, kelp production had become a vital source of income for many Highland crofters. Landlords encouraged kelp harvesting, seeing it as a profitable way to utilize the labor of tenants relegated to coastal lands. However, the kelp industry collapsed after the Napoleonic Wars. With the reintroduction of Spanish barilla, a cheaper and superior alternative to kelp, and advancements in chemical production, kelp prices plummeted. The already fragile economy of the Highlands crumbled as tens of thousands of people lost their primary source of supplementary income. At the same time, the market for Highland cattle, another crucial component of the regional economy, suffered a sharp decline. The end of the wars reduced demand for cattle, and prices dropped drastically. Similarly, while sheep farming had been profitable for landlords in the earlier phase, falling wool prices in the 1820s and 1830s undermined this industry as well. Landlords, desperate to stabilize their incomes, increasingly turned to drastic measures such as clearing tenants from their estates to make way for fewer, more profitable sheep farms. Many landlords had borrowed heavily to fund estate improvements or to weather earlier economic downturns. The collapse of these key industries left them deeply in debt. For some, the only way to avoid bankruptcy was to clear their estates of tenants altogether, reducing administrative costs and making room for more efficient large-scale sheep farms. In the 1840s, a devastating potato blight swept through the Highlands, mirroring the crisis that struck Ireland during the same period. Potatoes had become the staple crop for crofters, accounting for the majority of their caloric intake. The failure of this essential crop left communities facing starvation. The blight first appeared in the Highlands in 1846 and persisted into the early 1850s, leading to several consecutive years of failed harvests. Crofters who had already been living at subsistence levels were left with no means to feed their families. Starvation became widespread, and many Highlanders succumbed to disease exacerbated by malnutrition. Landlords were largely unwilling or unable to provide sustained relief to their tenants during the famine. Some offered short-term assistance in the form of imported grain or employment on public works projects, but this was insufficient to address the scale of the crisis. For many landlords, the famine presented an opportunity to accelerate clearance policies. They reasoned that funding emigration for their tenants would be cheaper than providing ongoing famine relief. The famine triggered one of the largest waves of emigration in Highland history. Landlords often organized assisted passages, paying for their tenants to emigrate to destinations like Canada, Australia, and the United States. While framed as an act of charity, these emigration schemes were primarily motivated by a desire to rid estates of impoverished tenants who could no longer pay rent. For many Highlanders, emigration was not a choice but a necessity forced upon them by hunger and desperation. Faced with the combined pressures of overpopulation, economic collapse, and famine, landlords resorted to increasingly aggressive clearance policies during this phase. Entire communities were forcibly evicted from their homes, often with little or no warning. The process was frequently brutal eviction parties, often accompanied by law enforcement or even military forces, arrived to remove tenants from their homes. In many cases, houses were burned to the ground to prevent families from returning. The destruction of homes, combined with the loss of farmland, left families with no choice but to seek refuge in overcrowded crofting settlements, emigrate, or move to the lowlands in search of work. One of the most infamous examples during this phase occurred in the Hebrides, where landlords cleared entire villages to make way for sheep farms. In some instances, tenants resisted eviction, leading to violent confrontations. However, resistance was often futile against the organized forces of landlords in the state. The clearances during this period had a profound psychological impact on the Highland population. Families were uprooted from ancestral lands they had inhabited for generations. The eviction process eroded the cultural identity of the Highlanders, as Gaelic-speaking communities were scattered and traditional ways of life were lost. The trauma of these events left a lasting scar on the collective memory of Scotland. The Sutherland Clearances, orchestrated by the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland between 1810 and 1820, are among the most infamous examples of the Highland clearances. Under the guidance of agents such as Patrick Seller, the estate underwent dramatic improvements, displacing thousands of families to make way for sheep farms. In Strathnaver, one of the worst affected areas, eviction notices were served to hundreds of tenants. Homes were often burned to prevent reoccupation, forcing families to flee. Seller himself was accused of setting fire to a home with an elderly woman still inside, though he was later acquitted of wrongdoing. Resettled tenants were given crofts on coastal lands ill-suited for farming. Many were encouraged to engage in fishing or kelp harvesting, but these industries offered little compensation for the loss of fertile inland territories. The trauma of these clearances left a lasting scar on the community. The Sutherland clearances sparked outrage both locally and nationally. Reports of the evictions, including graphic accounts of burning homes, reached newspapers in London, fueling public condemnation. Despite this, the Duke and Duchess defended their actions, believing that the clearances were ultimately beneficial for the displaced tenants. For many Highlanders, emigration became the only viable option. Some left voluntarily, seeking better opportunities abroad, while others were forced to accept assisted passages offered by landlords eager to rid their estates of excess population. Highlanders emigrated in large numbers to Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. In Canada, Gaelic-speaking communities thrived in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island, where many sought to recreate their traditional way of life. However, the journey was often arduous, and settlers faced harsh conditions upon arrival. Emigration was a double-edged sword. While it offered the promise of a fresh start, it also meant leaving behind one's homeland, culture, and community. Songs and poems from the era, such as the Canadian Boat Song, express the deep sorrow and resilience of those forced to leave. By the late 19th century, growing public sympathy for the plight of the crofters led to significant political changes. The Napier Commission, established in 1883, investigated the conditions of crofting communities and highlighted widespread poverty and injustice. In response, Parliament passed the Crofters' Holdings Act in 1886, granting tenants security of tenure, fair rents, and the right to pass their holdings to their descendants. While this marked the end of forced evictions, it came too late to reverse the damage caused by decades of clearances. The Highland clearances were a defining moment in Scottish history, marked by economic upheaval, cultural loss, and human resilience. They serve as a poignant reminder of the complexities of modernization and the enduring impact of displacement. As we reflect on this chapter, we are reminded of the strength of the Highland spirit and the importance of preserving the heritage of those who were forced to leave their homeland.